On a cool autumn evening, the small town of Mill Creek was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes when a storm is just on the horizon. Claire had been at the general store all day, arranging shelves and making sure the few customers who trickled in found what they needed. Her life was simple, predictable even, and she liked it that way. Living in a town where everyone knew everyone was a comfort, though sometimes it did feel a bit too small. But that evening, as the sky turned dark with the promise of rain, Clara would find herself caught in something far outside her routine. She was just closing up shop when she heard it, the faint thud of hooves against the dirt road. It was strange because it wasn't often that someone would be riding into town at this hour, especially with the storm on its way. She peered through the window and saw a lone rider coming down the road, silhouetted by the flash of lightning. The horse's movements were slow and labored, as though it too was struggling against the wind. Clara stepped outside, her breath catching in the cool evening air. The wind had picked up and she could feel the first raindrops begin to fall. She didn't hesitate. The rider needed help, and she wasn't about to leave him stranded in the storm. She grabbed her jacket from the coat rack and hurried toward the street. By the time she reached the road, the rider was close enough for her to see that he was in trouble. His horse stumbled and he barely managed to stay in the saddle. The man, a cowboy by the look of him, was swaying and appeared to be in pain. His face was weathered, rough from days under the sun, and his clothes were soaked through from the rain that was now pouring harder. Clara rushed toward him, calling out, "Hey, are you okay?" The cowboy glanced down at her, his face grim, and shook his head slightly, though it wasn't clear whether he was in pain or simply tired. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I'll be fine. Just need to get out of this storm." Clara didn't hesitate. "You won't make it in this weather. Come on, I'll help you." She reached up to steady his horse, guiding it carefully to the small porch of the store. The cowboy didn't protest, and he didn't say much as he dismounted, his legs shaky beneath him. Clara could see that he was hurt, but the full extent of his injury was hard to tell in the dim light. "You need to sit down," Clara said gently, guiding him inside. The cowboy seemed grateful, though he didn't show much emotion. Clara quickly locked the door behind them to keep the storm out, and then led him to a chair by the stove. She could hear the rain pounding against the windows and the wind howling as it whipped through the streets. It was going to be a long night. She returned to him with a warm towel to drape over his shoulders. He winced when she touched his arm, and Clara's concern deepened. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling down to check the severity of his wound. The cowboy hesitated for a moment before speaking, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "Just a fall. I've been on the road for days, and I didn't take care of myself. It's nothing, really." Clara was no doctor, but she could tell that it was more than just a fall. The man's face was pale, and there was a faint, feverish sheen to his skin. She could see the tension in his jaw as though he was trying to hide the pain. "Well, you're in luck. I might not be a doctor, but I can patch you up until we figure out what to do." She moved to get a few supplies, her mind already working on what to do next. She was used to helping out when someone was hurt, whether it was a small cut or something more serious. But this man was different. There was something about the way he carried himself that made her think there was more to him than just the tired, rough cowboy she had first seen. Clara's hands moved quickly as she worked, setting aside her thoughts for the moment. The cowboy's face was a mix of gratitude and exhaustion as he sat silently, letting her take care of him. She didn't ask for much in return. It wasn't her way. Helping others was just something she did. The rain continued to pour outside, the storm now fully upon them. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling the windows and doors. Clara glanced at the clock. It was getting late, and the cowboy would need to rest if he was going to recover, but she knew he wouldn't be able to ride out in that weather, not in his condition. "You're welcome to stay the night," Clara said softly, offering him a place by the stove. "There's no way you're making it out there in this storm." The cowboy nodded slowly. "I don't want to trouble you." "You're not troubling me. You need rest, and you can't go anywhere tonight." He seemed to consider this for a moment before agreeing. Clara set up a small cot for him in the back room. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. She then brought him a warm meal, and though he ate in silence, Clara could see the relief in his eyes. She knew he wasn't the type to accept help easily, but something in his posture seemed to soften as the night wore on. After the meal, she made sure he was comfortable before turning to leave the room. "I'll check on you in the morning," she said, her voice soft. "Thanks." For everything, he replied quietly. Clara paused at the door, giving him a small smile. It's nothing. Get some rest. She closed the door gently behind her and retreated to the front of the store. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the night made the world feel peaceful. Clara settled into her chair, her mind wandering as she thought about the cowboy she had helped. She didn't know who he was, where he came from, or why he had ended up here, but something about him felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew she hadn't just helped a random traveler. There was more to this man than she could see. As the storm howled outside, Clara drifted off to sleep, unaware that the simple act of kindness she had extended that night would lead her down a path that would change her life forever. The next morning, Clara woke early, as she always did. The storm had passed and the sky was clear, but a chill still hung in the air. She rubbed her eyes and stretched, the quiet of the house settling around her. She could hear the faint crackle of the fire in the stove, the only sound in the stillness of the morning. She made her way to the back room where the cowboy had spent the night. She had to admit she hadn't been sure what to expect when she first helped him into the house. She had done it out of kindness, but something about him had made her wonder who he really was. She had a sense that he wasn't just another stranger passing through, but it wasn't until now that she could start to understand him. The door to the back room was slightly ajar. Clara knocked softly before entering. The cowboy was sitting up in bed, looking out the window at the now clear sky. He was still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, though they looked much worse for wear. His face had softened overnight, the tension gone, but he still looked exhausted. "Morning," Clara said gently, stepping into the room. She didn't want to startle him, but she also didn't want to ignore his presence either. He turned to look at her, his expression neutral, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "Morning," he replied. "You didn't need to help me like this." "I'm sure I could have managed," Clara smiled back, though it was a little more tired than usual. "You looked like you could use a hand." "Don't worry about it." "It's what I do." He nodded, and for a moment the room was filled with an awkward silence. Clara didn't know what to say. She had never been good at small talk, especially with someone she didn't know, but she couldn't help but be curious. Who was this man really? He wasn't a typical traveler, that was for sure. "How are you feeling?" she asked, trying to break the silence. The cowboy stretched slowly, testing his limbs. "Better. The pain's gone down a bit. Thanks to you." Clara moved to the side of the bed to check on him. "I'll get you something warm to eat," she said, turning away before he could protest. She didn't want to push him too much, but it was clear that he needed a good meal. He had barely touched his dinner the night before. When she returned with a steaming bowl of soup, she found him still sitting by the window, deep in thought. She placed the bowl on the small table next to him and sat down across from him. He looked at her for a moment before picking up the spoon. "You don't have to stay here," he said quietly, his voice still rough from the previous day's exertion. "I'll leave once I'm able to ride." Clara raised an eyebrow, surprised at how quickly he was ready to leave. "You don't have to rush off. The storm passed, but it's still early, and you've just started to recover. You can stay as long as you need." The cowboy paused, then set the spoon down. His eyes flickered to hers, and for the first time, Clara saw something more than just a tired traveler. There was a weight behind his gaze, as though he was trying to decide whether to trust her or not. It was a look she had seen before, in others who had secrets they weren't ready to share. "I'm not the type of person who likes to burden others," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I've been on my own for a long time. It's hard to accept help sometimes." Clara nodded, understanding more than he realized. She had seen it in others before. Pride, the kind of pride that made it difficult to admit when someone needed help. But she also knew that people didn't always come to others for help unless they really needed it. "Well," she said, offering a warm smile, "it's not a burden. I'm happy to help. And besides, you're in no condition to be traveling just yet, so let's not rush anything, okay?" The cowboy hesitated but then nodded, his expression softening. "Okay, thank you." Clara gave him a reassuring smile before standing up. "I'll let you eat. I'll be outside if you need anything." As she left the room, she couldn't help but wonder about the man she had taken in. There was something about him, something that didn't fit the image of the rough, solitary cowboy he appeared to be. His reluctance to accept help, his quiet demeanor, the way he seemed to be hiding something, it all made her curious. She spent the next few hours tending to her usual tasks. She gathered firewood, cleaned up the shop, and made sure everything was in order. It was routine, comforting in its simplicity. But even as she worked, her thoughts kept returning to the cowboy in the back room. Who was he? What was he doing here? And why had he seemed so guarded, even when she was only trying to help? Later that afternoon, when the sun had risen higher in the sky and the warmth of the day started to break through the cool air, Clara returned to the back room to check on him. She knocked softly before entering. This time the cowboy was lying down on the bed, his eyes closed. Clara didn't want to disturb him, but figured it was a good time to make sure he had everything he needed. She quietly set a glass of water on the nightstand beside him, careful not to wake him. But when she turned to leave, she heard him speak. "Clara," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She stopped in her tracks and turned back to him. "Yes?" The cowboy was still lying there, his eyes open now, staring at the ceiling. He didn't look at her, but there was a certain calm in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his words sincere. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done." Clara smiled, though her heart tugged a little. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, and it made her wonder just how much he had been carrying all these years. "Don't worry about repaying me," she said, her tone light. "Helping others is what I do. No need to make a big deal of it." The cowboy gave a small nod but still didn't meet her eyes. Clara hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said gently. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." He didn't respond immediately, but she could see the shift in his expression. There was a vulnerability there, a flicker of something that he wasn't ready to share, but she could tell that it was there, just beneath the surface. "I'll keep that in mind," he said quietly. Clara nodded and turned to leave, but this time, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. She didn't know what that something was, but she knew that the cowboy was about to change her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. Over the next few days, Clara continued to care for the cowboy. His injury slowly healed, and with each passing day, he seemed more at ease in her home. He no longer wore the strained, guarded expression he had when she first met him. Instead, he seemed more relaxed, though still quiet. He wasn't the type to talk much, but Clara found that she didn't mind. His presence was enough. She could tell that there was a lot more to him than he let on, but he wasn't ready to share any of it with her yet. In the mornings, Clara would make him breakfast, and they would sit at the small kitchen table in silence, eating together. He never made much conversation, but he didn't need to. Sometimes the simple act of sharing a meal was enough. Clara would ask him how he was feeling, and he'd reply with a simple, "better," or "still a little sore." But beyond that, he didn't offer much information. He wasn't one to burden others with his troubles, or at least that was how it seemed. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the air had warmed, they would sit outside on the porch. Clara would knit or read a book, while he would sit in a rocking chair, his eyes often fixed on the horizon. There was a certain quiet about him, a peace that made Clara feel like they didn't need to speak. She could sense that he was a man who had lived a hard life, one full of struggles and perhaps even regret. But she didn't press him to talk about it. She knew that when he was ready, he would share what he felt comfortable with. Despite the silence, Clara began to enjoy these quiet moments with him. There was something soothing about the way he carried himself, the way he seemed so at home in the stillness of the world around them. It was different from the hustle and bustle of the town, where everyone seemed to be in a rush all the time. Here on the porch of her little home, the world felt slow and steady. It was a kind of peace she hadn't realized she was missing until now. One afternoon, after a long stretch of quiet days, Clara returned to the porch to find him not in his usual spot. Instead, he was standing by the edge of the garden, looking down at something in the dirt. His posture was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara could sense that something was bothering him, so she approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently, keeping her voice calm. The cowboy didn't turn to face her right away. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes scanning the earth in front of him. After a moment, he finally spoke, his voice low. "I don't know," he said, his tone heavy with uncertainty. "I keep thinking about how I got here, how I ended up in this place." Clara waited for him to continue, but he didn't. She took a step closer, trying to understand. There was something he was grappling with, something deep inside him that he wasn't ready to say. She knew that feeling well. It was the feeling of being caught in a moment of reflection, unsure of how to move forward. "I'm not one to open up easily," he added as if reading her thoughts. "I've spent most of my life on my own. It's hard to let anyone in." Clara nodded, her heart softening at his words. "I understand," she said quietly. "You don't have to share anything you're not ready to. I'm just here to help in whatever way I can." The cowboy's eyes flickered toward her, and for the first time, she saw a flash of something different in his gaze. Vulnerability. It was fleeting, but it was there. He seemed to be considering her words, as if weighing the idea of opening up to her. "You've been kind to me," he said after a long pause. "I don't know why. Most people wouldn't have bothered, not with someone like me." Clara smiled softly, her voice steady and comforting. "Everyone deserves kindness, no matter who they are or where they come from." The cowboy seemed to think about that for a moment, and then he looked away, back at the dirt in front of him. "I've never been much for receiving kindness. It's hard to accept something you don't think you deserve." Clara could feel the weight of his words, and she understood. There were times in her own life when she had felt the same way, when accepting help or kindness felt like admitting weakness. But she had learned over the years that sometimes accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It was about trusting others, allowing them to be there for you when you needed it most. "You don't have to feel like you don't deserve it," Clara said softly. "It's okay to accept kindness, and it's okay to ask for help when you need it." The cowboy didn't respond immediately. He seemed lost in his thoughts again, his gaze still fixed on the ground. Clara knew that it would take time for him to open up fully. Trust wasn't something that happened overnight. It was built over time, piece by piece, and she was willing to wait. That evening, after a quiet dinner, the cowboy stood up and stretched his legs. "I think I'll take a walk," he said, his voice sounding a bit lighter than before. Clara looked up from her plate, surprised. "A walk in the dark?" The cowboy shrugged. "I'll be fine. Just need some air." He grabbed his coat and headed out the door before Clara could protest. She knew there was no stopping him when he got that look in his eye, the kind of determination that came when someone needed space to think. She watched him walk down the path, disappearing into the night, and though part of her wanted to call after him, she knew he needed this moment alone. The house felt emptier without him. Clara finished her dinner in silence, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She thought about the cowboy, about how much he had changed since the first day she met him. He was still guarded, still holding back, but there was a softness to him now, a gentleness that had begun to emerge. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the night wore on, Clara found herself thinking about the cowboy more than she expected. She didn't know why he had come to town or why he had ended up in her life, but there was something about him that made her feel like she was meant to help him. It wasn't just the injury that had brought him here. It was something deeper, something unspoken, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something more than just a simple act of kindness. When the cowboy returned hours later, he was quieter than usual. His eyes were distant, and Clara could tell that something had shifted in him during his walk. He didn't say much when he came back inside, just thanked her for the meal and headed to bed. The days following the cowboy's quiet walk were filled with more routine. Clara continued to care for him, making sure he ate and rested, though she could sense a distance growing between them. He seemed more withdrawn than before, less willing to engage in conversation and more inclined to spend time by himself. There were moments when Clara would catch him staring off into the distance, his eyes distant and unfocused. She didn't push him. She understood that healing, both physical and emotional, took time. She was patient, and though it bothered her, she knew that in his own way he was trying to work through something deep inside. She hadn't seen him quite as much during the mornings either. He'd begun taking long walks on his own, leaving early and returning only when the sun had set. Clara didn't mind, though she often found herself worrying about him. There was something in his demeanor that made her feel as though he was carrying a heavy burden, something he didn't know how to put down. She couldn't help but wonder if he was ever going to let her in, to tell her what was really on his mind. But she wasn't going to force it. If and when he was ready, she would be there. One morning, Clara was busy organizing the small shop when the cowboy came in, his expression more solemn than usual. He had his coat on, and his eyes were tired, but there was something different about him this time. Clara looked up from the counter and smiled, but her smile faded when she saw the look on his face. "Morning," she said softly, trying to keep her voice light. "You're up early." The cowboy nodded but didn't smile. Instead, he just stood there for a moment as though he was working through something in his head. Clara could see the hesitation in his eyes, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. "I need to talk to you," he said finally, his voice low. There was a seriousness to his tone that made Clara pause, her heart skipping a beat. "About why I'm here." Clara set the jar she had been working on down on the counter and turned to face him fully. She nodded, her expression gentle. "Of course," she said, her voice calm. "Whenever you're ready." He seemed to struggle for a moment, his eyes flickering to the door as if considering walking out instead of continuing the conversation. But he didn't leave. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped closer to the counter. "I'm not just some cowboy passing through," he began, his words slow but deliberate. "I didn't end up here by accident. I came because I've been running from something." Clara didn't interrupt. She could feel that he was inching toward something important, something he had been keeping hidden for a long time. She simply nodded, giving him the space he needed. "I own the hospital here," he said, the words hanging in the air for a moment as Clara processed them. Her eyebrows furrowed in surprise. "The hospital?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You own the hospital?" The cowboy nodded, his gaze avoiding hers for a moment. He looked down at the floor as though ashamed of what he had just revealed. "Yeah, I built it. I funded it. But I've kept my name out of it. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want anyone to treat me differently because of it." Clara's mind was racing. She had heard rumors about the town's benefactor, the mysterious person who had single-handedly built the only hospital in town, but she had never suspected it was the cowboy, this quiet, reserved man who had come to her for help only days ago. "I don't know why I didn't tell you sooner," he continued, his voice quiet now. "I guess I didn't want you to look at me and think I was some kind of rich man who could buy anything he wanted. I didn't want your help to feel patronizing." Clara was silent for a moment, letting his words settle in. She didn't know how to respond. She had always assumed that the town's benefactor was a faceless figure, someone far removed from the everyday lives of the people who lived here. The idea that the man standing in front of her, this cowboy, who had been nothing but humble and kind, was the one behind it all, was almost unbelievable. "You've been running from it?" Clara asked softly, her voice gentle. "Why?" He looked up at her then, and there was a sadness in his eyes that made her heart ache. "Because of my past," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've done things I'm not proud of. I thought building the hospital would make up for them, but it hasn't. It's just made things more complicated." Clara took a deep breath, trying to understand. The man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, the man she had helped without knowing anything about his true identity, was carrying a burden far heavier than she could have imagined. And now here he was, standing in front of her, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I didn't want anyone to know," he continued, his words slow and deliberate. "I didn't want anyone to look at me and think I was doing this for the wrong reasons. I wanted to be a part of this town to make a difference. But I was scared that if anyone knew who I really was, they'd only see my past, and I didn't want that." Clara's heart softened as she listened. She could hear the pain in his voice, the regret that lingered in every word. She couldn't begin to imagine what he had been through, but she could tell that it had shaped him into the man he was now. A man who wasn't sure if he deserved forgiveness, let alone kindness. "You don't have to be ashamed of what you've done," Clara said, her voice steady. "Everyone has a past. It doesn't define who you are now. What matters is what you do with the present, what you do to make things right. And you've already done that by building the hospital. You've helped so many people here." He shook his head, his eyes filled with doubt. "But I'm still running from my past. I'm still hiding from it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for the things I've done." Clara stepped closer to him, her gaze soft but unwavering. "You don't have to forgive yourself all at once. It takes time. What matters is that you're trying, and that's enough. You're doing what you can to make things better, and that's all anyone can ask for." For a long moment, the cowboy was silent. Clara could see the weight of his words sinking in, the truth of what she had said resonating with him. He wasn't ready to let go of his past, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand that he didn't have to carry it alone. "I'm glad I met you," he said finally, his voice low but sincere. I don't know where I'd be right now if you hadn't helped me. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. I'm glad you're here too. For the first time since they had met, the cowboy looked at her with something like hope in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. And Clara realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were both on it now, together. The days following their conversation felt like a shift in the air. There was an unspoken understanding between Clara and the cowboy. Though the weight of his past still hung heavy on him, there was something lighter in his step. He wasn't the same man who had arrived at her doorstep weeks ago, wounded and weary. There was a spark of hope in his eyes now, even if he wasn't ready to fully embrace it. Clara knew that the healing he needed wasn't just physical, it was deep within him, and while she wasn't sure how long it would take, she was willing to walk beside him for as long as he needed. The cowboy spent more time with Clara in the days that followed. He helped around the house, chopping wood, fixing small things that had been broken for months, and even offering to help with the store. Clara allowed him to, though she could see the hesitation in his movements. He wasn't used to being part of something, to relying on others. But slowly he began to let his guard down. She noticed the small changes, the way he smiled more often, the way his shoulders weren't as stiff when he walked. It wasn't much, but it was progress. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara and the cowboy sat outside on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the air was warm, carrying with it the promise of another peaceful evening. Clara leaned back in her chair, her feet propped up on the railing, and watched as the cowboy gazed out at the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. The cowboy nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at the fading light. "Yeah, it is. I don't think I've really stopped to look at the world in a long time." Clara tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" He was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been so focused on running, on trying to outrun everything from my past, that I never really took the time to appreciate the good things around me. I was always looking ahead, always thinking about the next step, the next place to go, but I never stopped to really look." Clara smiled softly, her gaze fixed on him. "I think a lot of people do that," she said. "We get so caught up in where we're going or where we think we need to go that we forget to appreciate the moments along the way." The cowboy turned to look at her then, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think you're right." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the sounds of the evening settling around them. The crickets chirped in the distance, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees added to the peaceful atmosphere. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like the world had slowed down. There was no rush, no pressure. It was just the two of them, sitting together, sharing a moment of stillness. As the days passed, Clara began to notice something else, a subtle shift in the way the cowboy spoke about his past. He didn't shy away from it as much as he had before. He began to open up little by little, sharing small pieces of his story with her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He spoke about his time growing up, the things he had seen, the mistakes he had made. He didn't go into detail, but there was an honesty in his words that Clara hadn't expected. "I wasn't always a cowboy," he told her one evening as they sat around the fire. "I grew up in the city, in a place that wasn't exactly kind. My parents, they weren't good people. I didn't have much of a childhood, not the kind most people think of. I had to learn to fend for myself pretty early on." Clara listened quietly, her heart aching for him. She didn't interrupt, allowing him to speak when he was ready. "I left home when I was 16, he continued, his voice distant. "I thought I could make a better life for myself, but I just ended up running. I didn't know what else to do, so I became a cowboy, traveling from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to get too attached. I kept running, thinking that if I could just outrun my past, I'd be free." Clara took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. She had known that the cowboy had a past, but hearing the pain in his words made her realize just how deeply it had shaped him. She wanted to say something, to offer him comfort, but she didn't know what would make a difference. She only knew that the man in front of her wasn't the same man who had first arrived in town. He was someone different now, someone who was beginning to face the truth of his past. "You don't have to keep running," Clara said softly. "You're not alone anymore. You've built something here. The hospital, the town, it's all part of you now. You've done something good. The cowboy didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the fire in front of them. After a long pause, he looked at her, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before. I'm trying, he said quietly. I'm trying to make things right. But sometimes it feels like I'm just pretending. Clara shook her head, her voice firm. You're not pretending. You've already done more than most people ever will. You've helped this town. You've given people something they never had before. That's real. The cowboy gave a small nod, though it was clear that he wasn't entirely convinced. He wasn't ready to let go of his guilt yet, but Clara could see the seeds of something new beginning to grow within him. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing still, facing his past and trying to make a life for himself in a place that had become more than just a stopping point. The next few weeks passed in much the same way. The cowboy continued to recover, though his healing wasn't just physical anymore. There was a shift in him that Clara couldn't quite put her finger on, but she could feel it. He was beginning to accept that he had a place here. He was starting to understand that he didn't need to run anymore, that he could stay and build something real, something lasting. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the cowboy turned to her, his expression serious. I've been thinking, he began, his voice steady. I don't want to keep running. I don't want to keep hiding from my past. And I don't want to hide from this town anymore either. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but I can't change that. What I can do is try to make up for it. Clara looked at him, her heart full. You already have, she said softly. You've already made a difference here. And you don't have to do it alone. We're all here to help. The cowboy smiled, though it was a small, tentative smile. I know, he said. And I'm grateful for that. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding between the two of them. Clara knew that the cowboy wasn't fully healed, that he was still working through his past. But she also knew that he was finally at peace with the idea of staying. He wasn't running anymore, and that was enough for now. As the days turned into weeks, Clara and the cowboy grew closer. They worked side by side, building not just the hospital but their lives in the small town. It wasn't easy. And there were moments of doubt, moments when the past seemed too heavy to bear. But through it all, they had each other, and that made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, the cowboy felt like he had a home. And it was with Clara, in the quiet town where he had finally found peace. As the months passed, Clara and the cowboy settled into a routine. The town began to feel more like home to him, a place where he wasn't just a man running from his past, but someone who was building a future. Clara could see the change in him. His shoulders no longer carried the weight they once had, and his eyes, once distant and guarded, now sparkled with a quiet confidence. He had found his place in the world, and it was here with her, in this small town that had been kind to him when he needed it most. But even with all the progress, there were still moments when the cowboy would retreat into himself, times when the pain of his past would resurface, when the memories he had spent so many years trying to outrun would come rushing back. Clara noticed these moments, and while she didn't push him to open up, she was always there, a steady presence in his life. She had come to understand that healing wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad days, but as long as they were together, they would face it all. One afternoon, Clara was in the garden when she saw the cowboy walking toward her. His pace was slower than usual, and there was a heaviness in his step that immediately caught her attention. She set down the watering can and wiped her hands on her apron before walking over to meet him. Hey, she said softly, sensing that something was off. You okay? The cowboy didn't answer right away. He looked down at the ground, his brow furrowed as though he was lost in thought. After a long pause, he finally looked up at her, his face tired and worn. I've been thinking a lot, he said, his voice heavy. About the hospital, about the things I've done. Clara gave him a reassuring smile, though she could tell he wasn't looking for comfort just yet. I know, she said gently. It's not easy. You've carried those memories for a long time. The cowboy nodded slowly, his gaze distant. It's more than that. I've been trying to fix things to make up for the past. But sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to be able to truly make things right. Clara could see the pain in his eyes, the frustration in his voice. She reached out and touched his arm, her gesture gentle but firm. You don't have to fix everything all at once, she said. Healing takes time, and you're doing the best you can. He looked at her then, his expression softer. I don't know if that's enough, he admitted. I feel like I'm running in circles trying to outrun the things I can't change. Clara felt a wave of empathy for him. She understood what it felt like to be trapped by your own past, to carry the weight of mistakes you couldn't undo, but she also knew that he was stronger than he realized, that he had already come so far. You don't have to outrun your past, Clara said quietly. You just have to learn to live with it. It doesn't define who you are now. The cowboy took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. He seemed to relax a little, though the worry lines on his forehead remained. I don't know how to stop running, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled, a soft, understanding smile. Maybe you don't have to stop running all at once, but you can start by taking small steps forward, one day at a time. For a moment, they just stood there, the silence between them comfortable but filled with unspoken words. Then the cowboy nodded slowly, as if accepting that he didn't have to have all the answers right now. Thanks, he said, his voice sincere. I don't know what I'd do without you. Clara reached out and touched his arm again, her touch light and comforting. You don't have to do anything alone, she said. We're in this together. As the days went by, the cowboy began to find a new rhythm. He spent more time working with the townspeople, helping with various projects around the community. He still had moments when the weight of his past threatened to pull him under, but with each passing day he grew stronger. He wasn't running anymore, he was facing the future, even if it was uncertain. Clara watched him, proud of the man he was becoming. He had come so far, from a man haunted by his mistakes to someone who was starting to believe in the possibility of redemption. It wasn't easy, and it would never be perfect. But it was enough. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, the cowboy turned to Clara, his face thoughtful. I've been thinking, he said, his voice soft but steady, about what you said about living with the past instead of running from it. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant. Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with warmth. I'm glad to hear that, she said gently. I don't have all the answers, the cowboy continued, his voice steady. But I think I'm finally ready to stop running. I'm ready to face everything that comes with being here, with being a part of this town. And maybe that means I can start facing my past too. Clara smiled, her heart full. You don't have to have everything figured out, she said. You just have to keep moving forward. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I think I'm ready for that. As the days turned into weeks, the cowboy and Clara continued to build their lives together. The hospital flourished and the town grew stronger thanks to their efforts. But more than that, they had built something deeper, something more meaningful. They had built trust, understanding, and a partnership that went beyond anything either of them had expected when they first met. The cowboy still had moments of doubt, still wrestled with his past, but he no longer carried that burden alone. He had Clara, and with her by his side, he knew that he could face whatever came next. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Clara looked at him, a soft smile on her lips. You've come a long way, she said quietly. The cowboy looked at her, his expression full of gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. Clara reached out and touched his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. We've done it together. And in that moment, the cowboy finally understood. He wasn't defined by his past. He wasn't defined by the mistakes he had made. What mattered now was the life he was building, the future he was creating, one step at a time. As the sun set on another day in the small town they had come to call home, Clara and the cowboy sat together on the porch side by side. And for the first time in a long time, the cowboy felt at peace. The days of spring gradually turned into summer, and with it, the small town began to bustle with activity. The streets, once quiet and empty, were now filled with the sounds of children playing, neighbors chatting, and the familiar hum of everyday life. The hospital, built with the cowboy's help, had become a cornerstone of the community, a place of healing and hope for so many. It was a symbol of the new life the cowboy had built for himself and the town that had embraced him. Yet despite the growth around them, Clara noticed that the cowboy had moments of restlessness. He would often spend hours outside, lost in thought, staring at the horizon. She could see that the peace he had found was still fragile, that the shadows of his past had not fully loosened their grip on him. It wasn't that he was unhappy, he was simply unsure. There were days when he seemed to doubt whether he truly belonged, whether he had earned the forgiveness he so desperately sought. One afternoon, As Clara worked in the garden, she caught sight of the cowboy walking toward the edge of the field. He was moving slowly, his head down, and there was something in the way he walked that made her heart ache. She put down her gardening tools and followed him, her footsteps light on the grass. When she reached him, he was standing at the edge of the field, looking out over the land. The wind was gentle, rustling the leaves of the trees, but he seemed lost in thought. Clara approached quietly, not wanting to disturb him, but when she was close enough, she spoke softly. "You've been out here a lot lately," she said, her voice gentle. The cowboy didn't turn to look at her right away. He seemed to be taking in the view, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he finally spoke, his voice low. "I don't know if I'm doing enough," he said, his words slow, as though he was working through them carefully. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not really a part of this, like I'm still the man I was before, even though I've tried so hard to be different." Clara stood beside him, looking out over the field. She understood exactly what he meant. The cowboy had worked so hard to build a new life, to make up for the things he had done in the past. But she knew that it wasn't always easy to believe in the change, especially when the weight of your mistakes followed you everywhere you went. "You are part of this," she said softly, her voice steady. "You've built something real here, something that matters. You've helped so many people more than you realize." The cowboy shook his head, a sigh escaping his lips. "It's not just about what I've done for others," he said quietly. "It's about who I am and whether I'll ever be able to let go of the things I've done. I'm trying, but sometimes it feels like I'm just pretending, like I'm not really changing." Clara felt a pang in her heart at his words. She knew the pain of feeling like you were never enough, like the past always had a way of catching up with you. But she also knew that true change didn't happen all at once. It was a process, a journey that took time. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not pretending. You've already come so far, and that's what matters. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying and learning and growing." The cowboy didn't respond immediately. He looked out over the land again, his eyes distant. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself," he said, his words heavy with the weight of years of regret. "There are things I can't take back, things I'll never be able to undo." Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. "Forgiveness takes time, and sometimes it starts with forgiving yourself. You don't have to have all the answers, but you've done something good here. You've given people hope." The cowboy turned to face her then, his eyes searching hers as if looking for some kind of reassurance. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice low. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "Yes," she said firmly, "I do. You've done more for this town than anyone could have imagined. You've created something that will last." For a moment they just stood there, the silence between them comfortable yet filled with unspoken understanding. The cowboy's shoulders seemed to relax, his gaze softening as he looked at her. He didn't say anything more, but the change in him was palpable. He wasn't the same man who had come to her so many months ago, lost and broken. He was different now, stronger, more confident, and perhaps most importantly, he was beginning to see that he didn't need to be perfect to be worthy of love and acceptance. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The cowboy had come into her life when she least expected it, and though the journey had been difficult at times, it had also been beautiful. Together they had built something meaningful, something that would last long after they were gone. "Do you ever wonder what the future holds?" Clara asked, her voice soft. The cowboy turned to her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "But I try not to get too caught up in it. I've spent too much time worrying about what's coming next. Now I'm just trying to focus on today, on what I can do right now." Clara smiled, her heart full. "That's all we really can do." The cowboy looked at her then, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've taught me a lot," he said. "About forgiveness, about moving forward. I don't know where I'd be without you." Clara reached out and took his hand, her grip gentle but sure. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she said softly. "We're in this together." And in that moment, the cowboy knew she was right. He wasn't alone anymore. He had found a place for himself, a home in this small town with Clara by his side. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the cowboy looked up, his gaze steady and calm. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the journey wasn't over. But he was no longer running from his past. He had found something worth staying for, a future, a home, and a love that he had never thought possible. The town around them continued to grow, and with it, the cowboy's sense of belonging. He had made peace with his past, and though it would always be a part of him, it no longer defined who he was. He had created a new life, one that was full of promise and possibility. And with Clara by his side, he knew that anything was possible.